it is popular among modern authors for the main characters in a story to be relatable and have flaws, often verging on the territory of an anti-hero. From niche fantasy books like Joe Abercrombie's First Law trilogy to more modern examples like the recently released Death of Robin Hood, modern stories seem to want their characters gray and not take a moral stance, all in the name of realism. But what are the virtues of a hero that is truly heroic? Hello and welcome to Consumers and Critics, where we consume and critique stories both old and new. In this video, we will be discussing the medieval poem Beowulf, and I want to focus a lot on what Beowulf teaches us about greatness and heroism. I must preface this video that I have not done a ton of research into the Beowulf poem itself, and I also have not done a college course on it as of yet. And when I was reading it, I realized that this poem is very deep, and there are so many things that I probably missed in this reading, but I still think my thoughts can contribute to the discussion on this masterful poem. It's definitely a story I want to return to and study more thoroughly, and honestly, this might be one of my favorite books, because it is not only an epic tale with dragons, ogres, kings, kingdoms, and brave knights, but because of its themes of the war between virtue and vice. And through that lens is how I want to approach this review. So if you're not familiar, the setup for the story of Beowulf is that there are people called the Scyldings, and their king, Hrothgar, builds a grand hall called Heorot. One night, while Hrothgar and his subjects are having a feast in Heorot, a beast named Grendel hears the revelry and starts to terrorize the Scyldings in Heorot. After a long period of despair in the land of the Scyldings, a knight named Beowulf comes from the land of the Geats, along with a company of soldiers to fight Grendel and end his reign of terror over the Scyldings. We do not know who exactly wrote the Beowulf poem, but what we do know is that the people who transcribed it were likely Christian clerics. And this is one of the most fascinating aspects of the poem because it is a fusion between paganism and Christianity. You can draw on a lot of similarities between this poem and that of the ancient pagan epics, from the protagonists striving for glory to the idea of fate within the story. There are also depictions of pagan practices such as building a pyre for the dead, which was actually a practice shunned by the Christian church because it was seen as a denial of the resurrection. Yet along with these pagan trappings, the poet also incorporates Christian elements into the story. The characters talk of a singular monotheistic god. Biblical allusions are also all over the place in Beowulf. Some examples are Grendel being a descendant of the biblical figure of Cain who murdered his brother Abel, along with the sword that Beowulf uses to kill Grendel's mother, and that sword has the story of the flood engraved into it. But because the poem is a mix of both Christianity and paganism, there is definitely a tension between the two worldviews. One of the biggest being the tension of the divine providence of God and the role of fate in the poem. In my interpretation, and from how the characters spoke about both God and fate, it seemed to me that God is in control of fate within the story, which is in direct odds with how fate is usually used, especially in the works of Homer. In Homer, the gods must submit to fate. For example, in the Iliad, the gods are free to interfere with the Trojans and the Greeks as they fight. But in the end, the gods must submit to the predestined end of the Trojan War determined by fate. But in Beowulf, it is God who is credited with Beowulf defeating his foes. For Beowulf often says things along the lines of God will decide if I beat Grendel and so on and so forth. However, the poet concedes that Beowulf takes place in a pre-Christian world and knows that the revelation that the characters have in the story is incomplete, but he portrays these characters as noble, if not godly, pagans. But honestly, what most fascinates me about this poem is not the tension between paganism and Christianity, the role of God and fate within the story, or when it was written, though all these do interest me. What I found most inspiring about the poem is the character of Beowulf himself. So Beowulf is the son of Ecgtheow, I have no idea if I pronounced that right, and is the nephew of the Geatish king Hygelac. It is alluded to in the poem that Beowulf, before his infamous deeds, was considered by the Geats to be kind of a loser, and this really is what probably makes him so eager for honor and praise. I say this with the caveat that when reading old poetry like this, I think it's really tempting to over-psychologize the characters, and I think doing that often takes away their mythic quality. So there are two readings you can take of Beowulf's eagerness for glory. The first one is the more pessimistic view, where Beowulf is simply a proud jerk who only cares about his reputation, and the ending could be used as proof, but we'll get to that later. And then there is the more optimistic interpretation of Beowulf's character, where he is fighting for his honor and doing these noble deeds for the good of others. I think it is the tendency of modern readers of Beowulf to lean towards the former interpretation of his character. Because through our modern lens, this guy is always praising himself and always wants more glory. And it's like, okay, bro, get over yourself, my word.
What the hey, dude?
And the reason why this is so is because we live in a society that is very comfortable with mediocrity. But in Beowulf, we see someone who aspires to be great, who aspires to be remembered for his great deeds. And I think in moderation, this is a good desire, and something I think everyone, in fact, should desire. I remember a couple of years ago when Timothée Chalamet received an award for, I think it was his role in A Complete and Unknown as Bob Dylan, and he mentioned how that the award was just a single step in his journey, because he said that he wanted to be great, and he hadn't gotten there yet. And I remember people almost marveling at the sentiment, because in our age of pleasure and distraction, we have forgotten what it means to be great, and I believe that Beowulf reminds us of what true greatness means. In Beowulf, greatness is not in the deeds themselves, but what is shown by those great deeds. Beowulf displays throughout the poem courage, generosity, wisdom, and even humility. And by showing these virtues, Beowulf proves himself to be a hero. And in our cynical age, we tend not to believe that heroes exist anymore. People say that a character like Beowulf isn't relatable enough or realistic enough. He needs to have more flaws, do more morally great things. And I mean, he does have flaws, but those flaws do not take away from the fact that Beowulf is noble and good. I mean, sure, maybe by modern standards, Beowulf isn't relatable, but why does he need to be? This is something I thought a lot about as I was reading Beowulf, and that is, so many people miss the power of what is called the archetype. In literature, an archetype is a type of character that is a pure representation of something. And what I love about archetypal characters is that they give us something to look up to. They are characters that we see and we can aspire to be like. I'm not saying that relatable characters are any worse. I enjoy those characters too. I just do not think that a character who isn't relatable is bad. And I will say, characters that we can look up to do appear in modern fiction, and they are relatable. But more often than not, the storytellers of our day show us what we are already and not who we should be. Especially in the past decade or so, we see stories rail against the traditional hero, and we seem to work as hard as we can to prove that the heroes that we love are no heroes at all. I mentioned the death of Robin Hood earlier in this video, and this is a perfect example of a heroic deconstruction. We all know and love Robin Hood, who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, who fights the tyrannical Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham. But in the death of Robin Hood, and I haven't seen the film, I'm getting this from the trailers, Robin Hood is a murderer and a drunk seeking redemption. It almost seems like storytellers try to take these mythic legends who people have admired for so long and bring them down to our level and sort of demythologize them. There's almost a part of us who is like the Joker from The Dark Knight, who wants to take the heroes of myth and legend and bring them down to our level. We always want to say, oh, nobody can be that noble, or oh, he's just a goody two-shoes. And we sort of dismiss it. Yet not only do we see deconstruction in storytelling, especially in stories like Dune, but we also see inversions. We get movies like Wicked, where it turns out the Wicked Witch of the West wasn't so wicked after all. She was forced to be like that by society. Who can blame her? Though not a straight-up inversion, the Rings of Power took the infamous Dark Lord Sauron and made him hotter and sympathetic. And as it turns out, not even Beowulf escaped inversion. In 1971, a man named John Garner wrote a book called Grendel. And you guessed it, the story recounts the story of Beowulf, but from Grendel's point of view. Grendel in the story of Beowulf, though, is the embodiment of hatred and violence. He is known as a kinslayer, born in the line of the first kinslayer, Cain. Grendel is an archetype of vice, just as Beowulf is the archetype of virtue. But in John Garner's book, Grendel isn't that bad. He's just a chill demon looking for the meaning of life.
Just chillin', killing.
And you know, he's mommy issues. I might honestly read John Garner's book and rant about it on the channel, but, you know, we'll see. But when I see things like John Garner's novel, I think to myself, why do we tear down the heroes and lift up the villains? And I think there's a couple of possible answers to that question. The first is that we want to understand people and sympathize with them. So we take pure villains and pure heroes and try to make them like us. We bring the heroes down and lift the villains up. The second option is that what if we want to justify ourselves? Because when we see a hero, perhaps we are ashamed because we know that we aren't like that person and maybe that we'll never be like that person. So we want that hero to have more flaws. And when we see a creature like Grendel, we see Grendel within ourselves. We see that hatred and that murderous desire. And so we try to make him look better. He has mommy issues. He was rejected by society. I don't think that's the mindset that writers like John Garner go into these stories with, but I do think that might be what makes them attractive. Tell me what you think of that theory in the comments. It might be a little far-fetched. Yet I do think that we are seeing a shift in the stories that we are being told these days. We are seeing more heroes like Beowulf, who aren't free of vices, but are still heroic. We are seeing more movies like the newest Superman that came out last year, which is an unapologetically hopeful and heroic movie. And even we see characters like Ryland Grace from the book and the movie Project Hail Mary, who becomes a sacrificial hero by the end of the story. And I do say all this with the caveat that not all movies or books with anti-heroes or character deconstructions are necessarily bad. There are definitely those which are interesting when done right, though I may disagree with the mindset behind it. The only ones I outright hate are the ones that are inversions of classic stories, where it turns out the bad guy wasn't so bad after all. So Beowulf was written in a time when stories were meant to show people how to live and encourage virtue. So we have Beowulf, who is courageous, generous, and so on, but we also have his enemies, who each of them embody a specific vice. And these vices were ones that were specially considered evil in the medieval world. The first one we've already addressed, and that is Grendel, who embodies kinslaying and hatred. And along similar lines, we have Grendel's mother, who is named Grendel's mother. She also embodies similar vices as Grendel does, but I think Grendel's mother is supposed to be an inversion of the feminine. I say this because right before we are introduced to Grendel's mother, we read about Hrothgar's wife, Waltheow, who is an embodiment of warmth and loveliness and generosity. This traditional feminine ideal, a woman who is gentle and gives life, is contrasted with Grendel's mother, who is harsh and bitter, one who takes life instead of giving life. Instead of being hospitable like Waltheow, she dwells in isolation. And Beowulf's third and final nemesis is ultimately his downfall, and this is the dragon. The dragon is not specifically named. The dragon, like we know them so well today, symbolizes pride and greed. Returning to the topic of inversions, dragons too have been inverted in modern storytelling. They were once something that represented the worst of human nature and creatures that needed to be killed. Now they are creatures that need to be trained. As of now, I have talked about the main representation of virtue and vice, but now I want to continue that analysis by breaking down the plot, and especially further breaking down the symbolism and meaning in the story. So the poem starts off with the lineage of Hrothgar. Now at first this may not seem like the most engaging opening to a story, especially since we are so used to a quick and punchy first line, but the worst thing you can do to an old book is hold it up to modern expectations. And in this time period, your family lineage meant something. Where you came from was often seen as affecting who you were. It had great impact on your reputation. And Hrothgar's line is filled with great man after great man, so it is not surprising that Hrothgar himself is a great king and builds the great hall of Heorot. And the poem does something really cool that contributes to one of the major themes of the story. That is, when he's recounting how great Heorot was, he adds at the end of his description how it would eventually fall during a civil war. And immediately we get the sense of the fleetingness of greatness and the fleetingness of prosperity. Indeed, the prosperity and the feasting in Heorot only lasts for a brief period of time, for soon Grendel emerges from the darkness and starts to terrorize the Scyldings and Hrothgar. The poem says that Grendel endured torment hearing the revelry in Heorot, and especially when he hears people singing of the creation of the world. And the poet shows us two things about the nature of evil in this description of Grendel. The first is that evil thrives in isolation. Grendel is portrayed as a creature outside of society, living alone, haunting the marshes. This is reminiscent of how the Cyclops is written in Homer's Odyssey. Homer gives us a brief glimpse into Cyclops society, if you will, and he tells us how they never visit each other, nor do they know each other's names. The second thing that the poet shows us about the nature of evil is that it hates beauty and joy, because those things are the exact opposite of what Grendel is. Grendel is hideous and perverse, a picture of the ugliness and murderous nature of humanity. He is not beautiful because he does not adhere to the source of beauty, which in the poet mind is God. In fact, the poet stresses that Grendel is in fact godless, and instead of having joy, he's only bitter, and bitterness is ultimately the root of hatred and murder. It is also made clear that Grendel is so deep and evil in wicked deeds that he will never repent of them. So Grendel terrorizes Heorot and the Scyldings, and a dark time begins for Hrothgar and his kingdom. The Scyldings sink into despair and start sacrificing to heathen gods. In a parenthetical paragraph, that's fun to say, the poet talks about how they did not know the true God, yet they did know of hell, and provides an interesting commentary on despair. Woe shall be to him that through fiendish malice shall thrust down his soul into fire's embrace, to look for no comfort, and no wise change his lot. Blessed shall be he that may after his death day go unto the Lord, and seek peace in the bosom of the Father. But lo and behold, across the sea from the land of the Geats comes the warrior Beowulf, knight of the king Hygelac, with his company of merry knights, and brings hope to the Scyldings. During the initial introduction and feasting that ensues after Beowulf's arrival, we meet a character named Unferth, a thane of King Hrothgar. Unferth is often seen as a foil to Beowulf's character. Where Beowulf is noble and brave, Unferth scoffs at Beowulf, but is himself a coward. Unferth tries to tear down Beowulf's reputation by telling him a story he heard where Beowulf and a friend went swimming, and his friend bested him. Yet Beowulf's reputation speaks for itself. And Beowulf corrects Unferth by saying that he actually bested his friend and even killed a few monsters. What a flex. But he says that he does not glory in it, and proceeds to tell Unferth that if it wasn't for his cowardice, Grendel wouldn't have been able to mess everything up so much. So Beowulf promises Hrothgar that he will defeat the mighty Grendel without a sword, because swords are useless against him. Hrothgar is extremely happy to see him, to say the least, and that very night, after all the Geats go to sleep in Heorot, Grendel comes and sees a full course meal laid out for him.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
With all the Geats laying around sleeping, he's just like, wow, this is going to be awesome. Grendel, however, doesn't get past the first course, because after he kills one guy,
One stupid guy who no one loves.
he decides to grab Beowulf for a nice main meal. But Grendel quickly regrets his life decisions and tries to run away. But Beowulf doesn't let that happen and rips off his arm. Grendel proceeds to go crying to his mommy and dies. This is the first instance of the virtue overcoming vice. The justice of Beowulf overcomes the Grendel's murdering nature, and the poem sees Grendel's death as the justice of God. Afterwards, Beowulf's reputation spreads, and feasting and celebration return to the halls of Heorot. It's really cool to see how, though the poet intersperses periods of celebrating in between Beowulf's battles, and it reminds us that though happiness is impermanent, so is suffering. And during the celebration, songs are sung and gifts are given. A lot of people will find these sections of the poem boring, but these scenes are nonetheless important. The songs that are sung during these moments often recount stories that hardly seem relevant to the main plot. But these stories serve many purposes. They can foreshadow events later in the story, or they can contrast or compare characters in the stories to Beowulf. It is almost like the poem at certain times measures Beowulf's virtue by comparing him to people in the past. Another thing this first period of celebration shows us is the generosity of King Hrothgar. And as I mentioned before, generosity is seen as one of the chief virtues of a king in the poet's mind. Shortly after, however, Grendel's mother comes back to avenge her son. Grendel's mother is described as a fierce destroyer in the form of a woman. And she comes to Heorot and, like Grendel, kills one man. I don't know how to pronounce this. I don't know. And so Beowulf and Hrothgar travel into the forest to avenge him. Beowulf descends to Grendel's mother's lair, which is underwater. And this descending is actually a literary trope called katabasis. Katabasis is a Greek word that means going down and is used throughout epic poetry. For example, in Homer's The Odyssey and Aeneid's Virgil, both Odysseus and Aeneas descend into the underworld. And Beowulf too must have his descent. So Beowulf arrives at the lair of Grendel's mother, and he tries to kill her with the sword that was given to him by none other than Unferth. And the sword is named Hrunting. But much like Unferth himself, the sword is a failure. This is significant because it shows that mere human craft cannot defeat supernatural evil. But then Beowulf finds a sword that was made by giants. The same type of giants, in fact, that Grendel's mother is. And as I mentioned previously, on the sword is engraved the story of the flood. And there are some really interesting meanings here. First of all, we have the irony of having the blade depict the flood, because the same flood that wiped out the giants now ties to the killing of a giant, that is Grendel's mother. Also, we get a picture of evil consuming itself. A sword that the giants made kills a giant, and then that same sword is consumed by the giant's blood after the sword kills it. It is the pattern of the worm of Ouroboros, the serpent that is constantly consuming itself. So once Beowulf kills Grendel's mom, the poet describes that the waters in which Grendel's mom lived go from tumultuous to calm. And the poet says that Beowulf purged the waters and purified them. So you could say that Beowulf is the first water purifier. So stupid. After Beowulf defeats Grendel's mother, we come to another period of celebration, and we come to possibly my favorite moment in the poem, which is Hrothgar's speech to Beowulf. This speech is an utter stroke of genius on behalf of the poet. He first commends Beowulf for his great deeds, and he tells him that his glory will spread. But Hrothgar encourages him to not grow prideful, all which unmoved by pride thou dost possess, keeping thy valor with discerning heart. He tells the story of a man named Hermod, who was a king of the Skillings. He too grew in fame and wealth, but it was to him and his people's detriment. Instead of growing in generosity and love, he grew in pride and greed. This is actually a genius piece of foreshadowing, because the vices of Hermod are the same vices that the dragon at the end of the story represents. It is also a key example of the random stories being told by the characters actually being significant to the overall plot. Hrothgar goes on to tell Beowulf how God grants great wealth and fame to people, but then those same people grow too comfortable and rest in their riches. They do not keep in mind that they will die one day, and their death comes upon them suddenly. Hrothgar says, thereafter, in the final end, it cometh to pass that his fleshly garb, being mortal, faileth, falls in death ordained. Beowulf must always remember that he will die, that he should countenance no pride. And this is a warning to those who aspire to greatness. Hrothgar does not say that wanting to be great is bad. As I said before, our culture could do well to aspire to greatness. But the achievement of greatness is dangerous. The fame and glory can go to a person's head, as we well know. That person will start to descend into pride. So how does one not become overly prideful of his great deeds? And Hrothgar gives us one of many solutions, and that is memento mori. Remember that you will die. In the end, the fame and the wealth that you gained will pass away. And remembering that you too will pass puts things into better perspective. For why would you be proud of something that you will eventually lose? Beowulf and Hrothgar say their goodbyes, and Beowulf travels back to the land of the Geats. Upon arriving there, he stops at a few places until finally visiting the king of the Geats himself, King Hygelac. This is another moment where Beowulf shows that for all the honor that he seeks, he still knows his place and shows his generosity and his respect for authority. Because after telling Hygelac about his adventures, he shares with Hygelac the prizes he received for his exploits. The story then has a time jump of about 50 years or so. Hygelac is dead, and Beowulf has succeeded him. And it turns out he listened to Hrothgar's advice, and he has become a good and generous king to his people. However, a dragon soon starts to terrorize the Geats, and Beowulf must make one last stand for his people. The dragon is awakened because a man trying to escape and appease the punishment of his lord flees to the dragon horde and steals a cup from him. The dragon, realizing that the piece from his hoard is missing, goes on an absolute rampage. Of course, many of you J.R.R. Tolkien fans will start to think of Smaug from The Hobbit, and Beowulf's dragon is 100% the inspiration for Smaug. Beowulf's dragon, like Smaug and Hermod, in fact, is the representation of pride and greed. There's a reason why it is called the dragon's hoard, because all the dragon does is hoard it, and does not spare any of it, not even one cup to help a desperate man. A backstory to the dragon's hoard is actually given in the text, and as it turns out, it was hidden there by the remaining survivor of a wiped out tribe, and the dragon found it and hoarded it all for himself.
It's mine! Give it to me!
So Beowulf bands together another merry troop of knights, and they go to fight the dragon. So all the knights stand by spectating, and Beowulf goes to fight the dragon. I think some people interpret this as Beowulf being motivated by pride. Again, this falls into a more pessimistic reading, because he tells the soldiers to stay behind. But Beowulf does struggle against the dragon. This isn't said in the poem, but it almost seems like he thinks that he still has the strength of his youth. His knights, which see this taking place, are too afraid to join the battle, all except Wiglaf, the son of Wistan. Wiglaf remembers the generosity showed to him by Beowulf, and what Wiglaf represents is sheer loyalty, and he adopts Beowulf's bravery. He rebukes the cowardice of his comrades. And together, Wiglaf and Beowulf defeat the dragon, but during the fight, Beowulf suffers a fatal wound, a venomous bite from the dragon. It suddenly hits Beowulf that he is about to die. As he dies, he thanks God that he did not fall prey to the vice of kindling. He thanks God that he never became like Grendel. Beowulf is able to look back on his life with pride and with very few regrets. He tells Wiglaf to get gold from the dragon's hoard, so that he may see it before he dies. Wiglaf does so, and upon seeing the treasure, Beowulf is again thankful that he was able to give the Scyldings one last gift before he passes. His last request is that they build a monument to him called Beowulf's Barrow, so that his memory and his deeds would live on. A messenger is sent to tell the Geats of the passing of their king, and the Geats mourn, and they dread that their enemies will now grow bolder and wage war upon them. For another time of peace had passed. Now it was time for more war and more suffering. The poem ends with Beowulf's funeral, and the Geats mourn the passing of their king. Thus be mourned the Geatish folk, their master's fall, comrades of the hearth, crying that he was ever of the kings of earth, of men most generous, and to men most gracious, to his people most tender, and for praise most eager. The ending is where the pessimistic and optimistic debate grows more fierce. Some read the death of Beowulf as a sort of gray area for his character. On one hand, he defeats the dragon and is able to leave the gold for his country. On the other hand, he requests the gold to comfort him at his death, and he requests that a barrow be built for him so that he can be honored more. So we are left with the question, did he care too much about the transient things of life and honor? I tend to take a more optimistic view of Beowulf's character, though I do admit that he may have had his mind set too much on things that don't ultimately matter. I love the poem of Beowulf so much. It is so rich in language and it is dense with themes. It really is probably one of my favorite stories of all time. There's something so ancient about it, so mythical. It takes us back to a time where there were monsters and heroes to slay them. And we can learn so much about the war between virtue and vice through the poem. We learn about courage, justice, humility, and so much more that I haven't not even touched on because this poem is so freaking dense. Like, even on top of all that, we have these deep philosophical themes about God and fate and the fleetingness of life. I want to encourage anyone who hasn't read Beowulf to give it a shot. And also, don't read it too fast. Read it slow. Enjoy the beauty of the language and what the poem can teach you about pursuing greatness and leading the virtuous life. I will definitely be returning to this poem in the future and gleaning more out of it. And I would love to see which translation I should read next. This read I was reading J.R.R. Tolkien's translation, which was very good. Tolkien's awesome as always. Thank you for watching, consumers and critics, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, just a little bit, please like, subscribe, and comment down below. What do you think of heroes? Do all protagonists need to be relatable, or should they be someone to look up to? What are the pros and cons of both? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.